My name is Katie MacDonald. I am one of the technical officers in the 3D workshop, and I've got a series of photos to show you about a slab build project that I made. And hopefully it will give you some ideas about how you could use the slab building process in your own work to make something with clay. So this is a house number that I made. To begin with, I worked out all of the pieces that I would need, and that sort of works kind of like a dressmaking pattern. So now you've got each different section, and you can see how much clay that you will need to roll out to make your piece. So I've labelled each piece so that I don't get mixed up when I'm working with them. It's also good as well because if you make something that you really like, it means that you can easily repeat it if you've still got all of the parts of the pattern. I also had a double piece of this one on the left here, which as I go through these photos, you will see how that helped me. So now you can see that I have rolled out the clay. Either side of the clay is two guides. Now that means that the clay will be consistent thickness, okay? So it's really important when you're slab building that all of your slabs are the same thickness, and that will prevent your piece, hopefully, from developing cracks. And also, it's good to take photos when you've got all of your pieces of your pattern on your clay so that you know which one is which when you move on to building. You can see those guides are probably about 12 millimeters thick. So it means that when the rolling pin does get down to those guides as you're rolling out, as you've placed those guides either side of your clay, the rolling pin won't be able to go any further down than the depth of the guides, so your clay will be consistent thickness. After I rolled out all of the slabs, I sandwiched them between some bits of MDF covering the whole of the slab. So you can see I've got a piece of MDF here, and then the slabs of clay in between, another piece of MDF, and then slabs of clay in between, and then another piece of MDF on the top. Now this absorbent material will be helping the slabs get to a sort of leather hard consistency. So they will be nice and firm and they'll be able to hold their form when I go on to carry on with the build. So you might need to leave the slabs overnight. And it also depends kind of on the weather outside. So if it's really sunny and hot, you'll have to leave the slabs for a shorter amount of time. If it's wet and cold outside, then you probably need to leave them for a bit longer. It also depends on the thickness of the clay. So the thicker the slabs, the slower they're going to dry out. So here you can see that I've cut out all of the sections of the pattern that I made out of paper. It's much easier to prepare all the paper template beforehand rather than juggling around with slabs of clay. So now I'm ready to start joining these vertical walls onto the base piece. You can see that I have this curved vertical wall here on that piece of the pattern, that bit of paper underneath there, and that's taken its form and becoming a little bit more leather hard standing up, so it's not completely flat. So now I'm ready to join those pieces. So remember, when you're joining any clay, the method that I use is to paint on water to both surfaces to be joined, and then cut in a cross hatch into both surfaces to be joined, and then use a bristly brush, not a soft one, to brush on more water so the clay starts to create its own slip. So slip is watery clay, and it basically acts as clay glue. Make sure that your slabs to be joined together are at the same stage of dryness, okay? This is to ensure that they shrink at the same rate together. So you can see my curved section here is getting ready to be stuck on to here. Make sure that you close the join as well around that edge of the join, okay? And here you can see that I've scratched up this area as well, ready for this wall to be joined on. So you can see all of the walls are getting stuck down now. And I've placed some bits and pieces, so I've placed this piece on top of the pattern here so that I don't forget which bit is what, because it's easy to get mixed up when you've got lots of rectangles of clay. All of the walls are joined on now, and you can see that I'm just using this wooden tool here to close that join around the edge there. If I zoom in a little bit, you can see all that edge being closed and making sure that there's no gaps, and I'm compressing those particles in the clay. So now I have added the top part on, the lid, and you can see that I have made it just maybe like a millimetre or two bigger around the edge. So now I'm going to wait for that to become a bit more leather hard and then refine the shape. As you're working with the clay, if you find that it begins to dry out a little bit too much, you can mist the whole thing with some water. But make sure that you're not applying too much water. You don't want to oversaturate the clay and open up the particles in the clay body. But you want to add enough water so that the clay is not getting too dry. So it's a bit of a balancing act there. So now you can see that the 1 is getting made up the same as the 9. So we've got the base piece here, and then all of the pieces that have been cut out to match the pattern there. And again, they're getting stuck on now. And that is ready for the top piece here to be placed on top. So remember, both surfaces to be joined, painted with some nice clean water and a bristly sort of hog hair brush preferably, but not too much water, remember, that balancing act. And then cutting in a cross hatch into both surfaces to be joined, and then painting on again with water so that the clay creates its own slip. So I've used the potter's knife to cut in a nice deep cross hatch around each side, but you can see in the tools that I'm using that there is a fork. So you can use a fork to help with that process too. So you can see that's the lid going on now. But with a slab build, with a blocky build, you want those edges to be really sharp and not wobbly, and that will make your piece look really refined. So what I would do now is leave that piece for all of those joins to kind of bond with each other and make friends. I've used this wooden spatula here to just tap on all the joins as well, so beating on top of this top surface to really compress the particles within the join. So now you can see that I have got some plastic here. I'm just going to loosely, really loosely cover that piece and then leave it preferably overnight for those joins to, yeah, like I said before, bond with each other and the piece to become a little bit more firm, working within that leather hard kind of realm. Once it's got to a firmer stage of leather hard, you can use the Surform tool between your thumb and your middle finger to refine the piece, to really get those edges nice and sharp, okay? If you use the Surform tool on clay that is too wet, it will clog the tool. But if you use it on some nice firm clay, it works like a little mini cheese grater. And yeah, you can start to refine the piece and make that form much sharper. You can see now I have refined the piece. The Surform tool has left a scratchy surface, which I decided to leave, but you can smooth that surface using the kidneys, okay? So you start off with a smooth steel kidney and then graduating on to probably a firm rubber kidney if you wanted to smooth these kind of scratchy marks. But with that craft crank clay, I think it kind of lends itself to that texture. You can see here that area is quite nice and smooth, whereas this area here is quite sort of like scratchy and rough. Okay, so I'm sort of playing around with those textures in this piece. Now I've started to use coloured decorating slip to start to add a little bit of colour before the bisque firing, to start to layer up and make a little bit of depth. So you can play around with the consistency of the slip. You can add water to it and you can work with it kind of like watercolors, or you can use it really thick and use it to create sort of like a raised decoration on your work. Okay, so play around with the thickness of the coloured decorating slip. So this is the piece after it's been bisque fired, okay, so it's been through that first firing, and I just wanted to show you the back of the piece. If you're making something that's going to go on the wall, remember you're going to want to think about how it's going to be fixed onto the wall. So I've made this hole. Remember that the clay is going to shrink by approximately 10 to 15%. So if you are going to use screws, remember to make that hole slightly bigger than the screw to make up for that shrinkage. You can see I've made 2 holes on the back of the 9 as well. If you're using slab building and you've got air trapped inside the piece and the piece is hollow, remember you are going to have to make holes in the piece somewhere for that air to escape when the piece is getting fired. Otherwise it will explode in the kiln. So this is the piece bisque fired. So through that first firing, I've used underglaze to make this kind of grid pattern on the surface as well. Now I'm going to use some oxides, okay? So if you're going to use oxides, you're probably going to want to have some gloves to protect your skin from the oxides, and you're going to want to wear a mask, a P3 filter dust mask, absolute minimum, when you're working with oxides, so you're not going to breathe any of those oxides in. You only need a tiny amount, so you can see that I'm using a turning tool, a bit like a scoop here, to scoop a small amount out and put it into a container. And then I've got a jug of water here, clean water, and adding that to the oxides. The water is just like a vehicle to apply those oxides onto your piece. I'm using a nice soft broad brush now to mix the oxides in the water, and then applying that to my piece. And you can see that I've painted the piece with the oxides now. So what I'm going to do now is use a sponge to clean off the oxides, because I just want them to go into that scratchy texture of the piece, to highlight the textures of the clay. So I'm using a sponge and rinsing that out quite often and turning it around to a different sort of part of the sponge each time. You can see now that I have cleaned most of the oxides off. And now I'm going to apply glaze. So when you apply glaze, you want to make sure that the piece is as porous as possible. So when I cleaned off the oxide, I left the piece overnight and then came back the next day. If it's cool to the touch, it means it's still got some dampness in it. If it's room temperature, then it means it's completely porous and you can start to apply glaze. So I've used a range of different glazes, but this copper red glaze is a stoneware glaze, so it's suitable for using with stoneware clays. I'm using Craft Crank here. Make sure that you mix the glaze up so all of those particles in the glaze bucket are suspended in the water. So you see that I've applied the glaze quite inconsistently here. I have used a sponge to apply it, and I've used some transparent glaze as well. So they all look sort of white and powdery, but that will change during the second firing. So this is now getting fired to stoneware firing. So around 1245 degrees for those glazes to mature and the clay to fully mature as well. So now this is the piece after the stoneware firing. So you can see the difference that the glazes have made. The copper red blue glaze that I showed you before is used here. And that is how I'm getting that sort of like toasted effect. And then I've got some transparent glaze giving that glossy effect on here. You can see the colours of the slip have changed as well and become darker. And here's the piece on the house.